Perfect. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. Please just give us a couple more minutes as we let some others join us, but thank you so much for being here this morning. All right, perfect. Thank you again. Thank you so much for joining us this morning for this virtual tour of the Timken Museum. Again, we're so excited to have you with us. Just a couple of housekeeping things before we get started. Please keep yourselves muted throughout today's presentation. If you do have any questions, we'd be happy to address those at the end of the presentation. Please use the chat function on Zoom in order to ask your questions, and we'll be happy to address those at the end. If you are joining us via Facebook Live, welcome to you as well. If you happen to have any questions, you can do the same using the comment section there on Facebook, and we'll be monitoring that and answering those questions at the end as well. Lastly, this meeting is being recorded, as I mentioned, and it will be posted to our social media channels, our Facebook and our YouTube channel at the end of today's presentation. So if you would like to go back and watch this presentation or any previous ones put on by the Timken, you can do that if you check out our social media channels. But otherwise, perfect. Again, thank you so much for joining us this morning. We have a really exciting presentation put on today by our lovely docent Eleanor on some painting pairs from the Timken Museum and beyond. So I'll go ahead and turn things over to Eleanor. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Samantha. Well, good day, excuse me, and welcome to today's virtual tour of the Timken Museum. My name is Eleanor Merle, and I'm a docent with the museum and delighted to be with you for our tour today. Now, artists commissioned to do portraits of a married couple will, of course, create a pair of paintings, one of each spouse. But have you ever considered works that are meant to be viewed together because the artist conceived the works as related? Or what about works by two different artists with a common theme and style? In this presentation, we'll take a look at various pairs that, when seen together, enhance the pleasure of each and expand our understanding and appreciation. So, having referenced the most typical type of paired paintings, let's begin with the portraits of a newly married couple by Frans Hals, done in 1624. Here we see a portrait of Aletta Hahnemann, who married Jacob Pietersz Alekhan in 1624. So let's take a closer look at the wedding dress of Aletta Hahnemann. Here we have 18-year-old Aletta Hahnemann, a merchant's daughter from Zwolle, a small town in the middle of the Netherlands. Aletta is wearing a costly bridal stomacher, and a stomacher is a decorated triangular panel that fills in the front opening of a woman's gown or bodice. In this case, it's worked with gold thread and shows various flowers symbolizing marriage. She wears the stomacher over a colorful purple and red skirt that's draped over a French farthingale, a wheel-shaped device meant to extend the skirt, causing the stomacher to protrude forward and support the heavy gold chain that's wrapped around her gown and through something called her vlieger. The vlieger was a full-length, sleeveless robe, open in front with two holes at the side for a belt chain. Her vlieger is edged with black velvet and shows off her stomacher and skirt. Sleeves were usually separate items, pinned or laced onto the jacket or bodice. In Aletta's case, she's wearing black silk sleeves that match her vlieger mantle. They're decorated with stripes and embroidery. Around her neck, she's wearing a starched linen figure-8 collar, and over her hair, she's wearing a white linen diadem cap with lace edging. The lace scallops are very large, showing off her wealth and status. These diadem-shaped caps were very common in the Dutch 1620s and 30s. She's holding a pair of embroidered bridal gloves and wears a wedding ring on her right forefinger. She's also wearing gold bracelets and lace wrist collars. Her ensemble shows her to be one of Hall's most wealthy sitters. Now, as for her husband, here we have a portrait of Jacob Pieters Olakan at 3/4 length. He stands, also turned 3/4 right, and looks to the left past the spectator. His right hand holds his hat. His left hand is pressed to his side. He wears a richly embroidered velvet costume with a short cloak and a lace-trimmed ruff with wristbands. Now, at about the same time, but in England, we have Anthony van Dyck, who worked primarily for the court of Charles I of England. In that capacity, he created this wonderful Timken portrait of Mary Villiers, Lady Herbert of Shurland. Anthony van Dyck painted this portrait of Mary Villiers around 1636, shortly after the death of her first husband, Lord Herbert of Shurland. Though only 14 years old at the time, she emerges from the plain, dark background in dignified splendor, pointing with her left hand to one of the black ribbons that suggests her recent widowhood. Her stylish reddish-brown S-curled ringlets frame her refined features, while drop pearl earrings and a pearl necklace emphasize both her physical and her moral purity. She wears the latest fashion, a glowing low-cut taffeta gown trimmed with silvery lace. Her calm, dispassionate gaze, showing inner resolve, like her pale skin, signify aristocratic refinement. Now, her left hand is in a traditional gesture of sincerity and affection. And with her right hand, she holds an inverted Provence rose, almost certainly signifying that the life of her beloved had been snuffed out well before his time. Mary was a favorite of King James I of England, and after her father's assassination when she was 6, she was raised in the royal household where she enjoyed the status of a princess. Charles I, the son of King James, arranged her marriage at age 12 to Charles Lord Herbert, who was then 15, the oldest son of Lord Pembroke, a man of considerable fortune and one of Van Dyck's earliest patrons. Lord Herbert and Lady Mary were married in the king's private chapel, a sufficient demonstration of the affection in which both were held by King Charles. Tragically, Lord Herbert died of smallpox just 2 years later in 1636, which is when this portrait was commissioned by Charles I, who hung it in his chamber. The artist had known Mary since at least 1633 and had painted her portrait in addition to other family portraits on several occasions. Here's one of Mary Villiers with her lady's maid, the dwarf Anne Shepherd, Mrs. Gibson, and it dates from 1638. Notice she's still wearing the pearl necklace, not sure about the earrings. Interestingly, while she's next to a dwarf, she nonetheless appears somewhat disproportionately tall. Sadly, Lady Mary Villiers' string of losses didn't end with the death of her father and her first husband. 2 subsequent husbands predeceased her, as did both her children at age 10, her son, and age 18, her daughter. Now, the artist Anthony van Dyck was a Flemish Baroque artist, and he was born in 1599 in Antwerp to a wealthy silk merchant. He was a very talented, precocious painter who started his training at age 10 and became an independent artist when he was 16. By 1618, when he was 19 years old, He'd become a master in the Antwerp Guild of St. Luke. In 1632, Van Dyck was invited to the court of King Charles and Queen Henrietta Maria. That same year, he was knighted by Charles and made principal painter in ordinary to their majesties, who commissioned numerous portraits from him, not only for members of their own family, but also for foreign friends and ambassadors. He received a quiet house of his own, along with a handsome pension of £200 annually. He was buried in St. Paul's Cathedral, an indication of his standing at the time of his death. Everyone wanted to be painted by Van Dyck, who was one of the first fashionable portrait painters, able to give an appearance of refined elegance to subjects who lacked those qualities. Now, also in 1636, Van Dyck did a portrait of Queen Henrietta Maria, who, as I said, was married to King Charles I. And it has several similarities with the portrait of Mary Villiers. We see in this portrait that Queen Henrietta Maria has the same pearl earrings and necklace as Mary Villiers, and a similar dress, also with the black ribbon of mourning. Mary Villiers was Queen Maria's lady of the bedchamber and accompanied the French-born queen back to France during the time of the English Civil War. In Van Dyck's portrait, the pregnant Queen of England cradles her arms over her abdomen while standing next to a crown that advertises her rank. Henrietta Maria commissioned this painting as a gift for Cardinal Francesco Barberini, who viewed the devout French-born queen as a critical collaborator in his dream of regaining England for the Catholic Church. Destined for a leading patron of the arts in Baroque Rome, Van Dyck's portrait was one of many diplomatic gifts that spread the artist's fame and influence throughout Europe. Now, Mary Villiers had many portraits done over her lifetime, and while the vast majority were done by Van Dyck, here's one done by another English artist, Theodore Russell. We don't know the exact date of this work, but certainly we can see that this artist depicts Mary Villiers with the same facial features, sad-looking eyes, small mouth, similar nose. Also notice the same pearl necklace and earrings. And of course, her hair is in ringlets, which was the style of the time. In the same time period, Rembrandt did his first portrait of Saint Bartholomew. We'll look at the three depictions that Rembrandt did of Saint Bartholomew over his lifetime. Saint Bartholomew was one of the 12 apostles, and according to ancient legend, he spread Christianity to Armenia, where his Christian faith resulted in his being flayed alive. The knife, his attribute, symbolizes his martyrdom and appears in all three works. The first work dates from 1631, when Rembrandt was only in his 20s. This work is renowned for having been stolen, along with three other works, from the Worcester Art Museum in 1972. Happily, it was recovered within a few weeks. Most people are struck by the artist's ability to capture and focus our attention on the emotional expression of this early Christian saint. Rembrandt was one of the greatest interpreters of biblical stories. Throughout his long and extraordinarily productive career in Leiden and Amsterdam, he turned repeatedly to the Bible as a source of inspiration for his paintings, drawings, and etchings. He depicted biblical figures as real people, not as idealized heroes, but as men and women who walk the earth with passions and beliefs, with fears and anxieties similar to those felt by the rest of humanity, thereby blurring the distinction between religious painting and portraiture. Rembrandt distinguished himself with his handling of paint and light. Here, the bold brushwork captures and gives immediacy to the saint's facial features. The knitted brow, penetrating eyes, slightly open mouth, all suggest St. Bartholomew's anxiety as he faces torture and martyrdom. This intense expression is accentuated by the dramatic lighting, which seems to emanate from the face of the saint. By contrast, the hand with the knife is placed in shadow, suggesting the impending danger connected with St. Bartholomew's missionary role. The painting, which is signed on the knife, appears to date from the early 1630s, as I said, probably 1631, and it attracted numerous students who were eager to adopt Rembrandt's style. Many of his pupils became accomplished artists in their own right, though their work has often been misattributed to the master. Finally, notice the eyes of this man. They pull you in so deeply and make this painting so incredibly emotional. It's St. Bartholomew's crossroad. On the one hand, he faces the brutal death of being flayed alive, but on the other hand, this very death shall deliver him from his pain and into the arms of the Lord in heaven. What he wants us to know is that there are no boundaries to what he would suffer for his faith, that even though he's alone and frightened, he's brave enough to stand up for what he believed to be right. St. Bartholomew is in a dark place, both literally and figuratively, and yet he finds strength and courage through his faith. Now, the Timken's portrait of St. Bartholomew was painted in 1657, at perhaps the darkest time in the artist's life. He'd achieved great critical acclaim and worldly success, but his fortunes then declined dramatically. In the 1650s, inspired perhaps by the difficulties in his own life, Rembrandt painted a whole series of apostles and evangelists in which he pondered the meaning of their spiritual quest and sacrifice. This portrait depicts a youthful St. Bartholomew sitting, looking pensive, leaning forward in a rather unsettled pose with his gaze averted to the viewer's left. Rembrandt creates this brooding quality in the dark browns of the painting, the broad, bold brushstroke, and the extraordinary sense of a man thinking and reflecting, which is conveyed by his raised eyebrows, his half-open mouth, and the strong shadows cutting across his face. In Rembrandt's paintings and etchings, light and shadow become powerful reflections of human emotion. There are at least two light sources here. His face is lit by light coming up from the left-hand side of the canvas, casting down over his head and catching his furrowed brow and hollowed cheeks. The other, far fainter in the right background, suggests a horizon line and a rising or setting sun, or perhaps a distant city. The artist used a method in which the brownish tonal underlayer remains visible in many areas of the canvas. One of his students wrote about Rembrandt's unusual abbreviated technique, saying it was a way of leaving alone things that were, and I quote, fortuitously apt when first laid in, end of quote. The sentiment echoes the Roman author Pliny's praise of artists who knew when to take their hand from a picture. St. Bartholomew was dressed in 17th century garb, a plain brown robe with a heavier buff-colored cloak that covers the chair. Now, as in each of the portraits, St. Bartholomew is shown holding a butcher's knife, symbol of his martyrdom, in his right hand. The knife is shifted slightly downward, appearing almost loosely held. Instead, the dramatic tension is internal, psychological. caught between two light sources, one of salvation ahead, the other suggesting foreknowledge of his grisly end, the apostle becomes, in Rembrandt's vision, a very human image of courage in the face of crisis. Now, this composition also reduces the knife's prominence, having the viewer focus primarily on St. Bartholomew's reflective gaze. The knife functions mainly as an attribute, not as a narrative element. In other words, the apostle doesn't contemplate his martyrdom, but like all of Rembrandt's apostles, is preoccupied by spiritual concerns, or more specifically, questions. There's a strong sense of pondering an ethical problem, which here seems to animate the eyes and forehead, the mouth, and the figure's unsettled probes. The hand with the knife is an effective counterpoint to the saint's expression, precisely because he, unlike the viewer, seems unconscious of what the object is. Now, a small trivia note, in the late 19th or early 20th century, whoever owned the work replaced the knife, painted over it with a book. In 1612, the knife was restored to the painting. Rembrandt celebrates texture using impasto, thick layers of paint, particularly around the apostle's face, reinforcing his furrowed brow and contemplative expression. Also note the burst of white at his cuff, in contrast to the dark brown everywhere else. Now, the last portrait of St. Bartholomew by Rembrandt was made just 8 years before Rembrandt's death in 1631. And again, St. Bartholomew holds the knife in his right hand. One of Rembrandt's neighbors may have posed as the model for this saint. By the way, this painting is in the Getty Museum. By showing the apostle as a common man, Rembrandt gave the revered holy figure a tangible human quality, suggesting perhaps that holiness is part of daily life, a view in keeping with the religious atmosphere of the mid-1600s Amsterdam. St. Bartholomew appears pensive, almost melancholy in mood. He holds his chin as if lost in thought, and his eyes seem to see beyond time. As with the Timken work, Rembrandt used a broader, freely brushed technique typical of his later mature style. Applied with a palette knife, thick areas of paint called impasto are visible on the saint's forehead, nose, ears, and hands. When Rembrandt died, October 4th, 1669, he was buried in a rented grave, which has long since disappeared, in the Westerkerk in Amsterdam. He's one of the most influential artists of the Baroque era. His work was admired and quite literally copied for generations of artists hoping to make contact with his genius. Now, again, as we mentioned many times, while St. Bartholomew was flayed alive, in Rembrandt's depictions, we never see this violence, nor he just doesn't ever carry his own skin. But I'd like to show you a work by Michelangelo. It's in his last judgment in the Sistine Chapel. And Michelangelo's St. Bartholomew is a very muscular depiction with a pretty grisly image of him holding his skin. This work was done 1536 to 1541. So let's stay in the Netherlands a bit longer and take a look at a work by Gabriel Metsu on a topic that was near and dear to the hearts of the Netherlandish people, letter writing. Writing letters became fashionable in Europe in the 17th century after the establishment of a postal system. In the Dutch Republic, education was strongly emphasized, and the population was quite literate at an earlier date than other European countries. As such, they developed the first system of mail. Unlike today, the addressee paid for the letter upon receipt, rather than the writer paying when it was sent. And the Netherlandish peoples loved writing letters. We know that the secretary to the Prince of Orange wrote 80,000 letters in his lifetime. This love of letters brings us to this small picture, a scene from everyday life. The young woman in the Timken painting is shown in an elegant garden setting framed by the arches of an open arcade, through which we can glimpse a grand Palladian villa in the distance, conveying elegance and wealth. The delivery of a letter by a messenger, noted by his black hat, appears to have interrupted the young woman, who sits with an open book in her lap. The flower in the bowl is a red peony, which represents family, happiness, wealth, and romance. As to the identity of the letter writer, art historians are quite certain that the gentleman in another Metsu painting, called A Man Writing a Letter, is the man in question. Some persuasive evidence supports the assumption that this other work shown here is the pendant painting. Their comparable size and complementary three-quarter length format support the assumption that Metsu conceived them as pendants or companion pieces. A close review of both pictures show that both desks are at the same level and both of the individuals' hands are in essentially the same position. There's a second person in each picture, and they appeared as a pair in 3 separate sales. According to a leading scholar of Metsu's work, Metsu represented himself as the man in the Montpellier painting and his wife Isabella as the model for this work. Now, Gabriel Metsu was born to the Flemish painter Jacques Metsu, and he spent a good portion of his life in Leiden, where he was a member of the Painting Guild. He left in his 20s after a scandal involving his visit to a brothel, and it was believed that he'd quit painting. But this isn't the case, as several of his works surfaced after he left the guild. Now, artists, in addition to Metsu, depicted women writing letters. And of the 35 known works by Johann Vermeer, were 2 actually which depicted a lady writing a letter. This one I'm going to show you dates from 1665. Now, above all, Jan Vermeer was a painter of light. In this exquisite painting, diffused light softly illuminates the tabletop, the woman's face, and her rich lemon yellow morning jacket. Accents on the pearls decorating her jewelry box, her earrings, and her satin hair ribbons further enliven the image. The woman's open gaze engages the viewer, and critics have suggested that the painting may be a portrait, perhaps a member of his family, instead of a generalized portrayal of a young woman at her writing table. So now let's move on to France and Nicolas de Lagière, who did 2 portraits of Barthélemy Jean-Claude Pupil and Marguerite de Sèvres, who was the wife of Barthélemy Jean-Claude Pupil. Now, if you were somebody in early 18th century France, you definitely wanted to have your likeness painted by an important artist. As proof of noble lineage and evidence of high social standing, portraits counted among essential decor in that country's elite households. Should you happen to be in Paris and were not a member of the royal family, it would have been in your best interest to approach Nicolas de Lagière for this task. Lagière's solid academic training meant that he was skilled at depicting courtiers in environments that communicated their prosperity and prestige. And because he lived for a long time, this painter was familiar with his sitters' expectations for both grand manner portraiture of the late Baroque period and more modern Rococo sensibilities. Depending on your taste and outlook, a cosmopolitan flatterer like La Jallière was equipped to provide a wealthy married couple with everything they desired in self-representation. These two grand portraits are among La Jallière's masterpieces, demonstrating years of the artist refining his skills and perfecting his talents. They were commissioned when La Jallière was 73 years old and still at the pinnacle of his career. We have in these portraits a lovely, somewhat royal depiction of Mr. and Mrs. Pupil. Painted in the Rococo style with deep roots in Baroque, La Jallière creates an air of self-satisfaction and confidence in his subjects. Monsieur Pupil opted to be portrayed in a relaxed yet professionally determined demeanor, wearing a long powdered wig known as a peruke and dressed in black satin judicial robes with a red cape. He gazes back at the viewer with impartiality and quiet confidence. His right forearm is draped casually over an oversized, leather-bound legal text with more great tomes behind him, partly hidden by elegant drapery, possibly his law library. His expression exudes a sense of well-nourished self-satisfaction that we might expect of a man at the summit of his profession. He was a prominent jurist, after all. Pupil had several years earlier married his social superior, Marguerite de Sèvres, and as a consequence of that marriage, he was awarded a series of increasingly prestigious legal appointments in Lyon. La Jallière has posed his subject as a public figure in the cascading wig and robes of a judge. The artist reveals his technical virtuosity in the lavish depiction of the robe's sumptuous fabric, shining black satin, the fine starched linen of collar and cuffs, and rich scarlet velvet with contrasting colors to enhance depth. Now, as a trivia note, wigs for men became popular with the reign of King Louis XIII, 1601 to 1643. He pioneered the fashion in 1624 when he became prematurely bald, and wigs were promoted by Louis XIV and spread to other European countries. Wig styles were defined by social status and standing, and generally, the higher a wig, the higher in stature the man wearing it, hence the term big wig. Now, Marguerite de Sèvres came from a Lyonese family whose importance is suggested by her regal bearing and her expression of confidence. Indeed, the setting and props were called contemporary royal portraiture. The wall behind her is covered in expensive blue damask or perhaps flocking. Baroque in style, her fur-trimmed scarlet robes evoke royal velvet and ermine, and her powdered hair ornaments hint at a tiara. By contrast with her more soberly dressed upright husband, Madame Pupil poses while garbed in a shimmering red gown trimmed with fur sleeves. She wears an ornamental cuirass or armored breastplate, from the top of which freshly cut carnations burst. This extraordinary embossed and jeweled bodice was a common prop during the 18th century to pay homage to the ancient world, as well as to attribute qualities of a god or goddess to the subject herself. Madame's bodice suggests the armor of Minerva, the Roman goddess of wisdom. She has sprigs of flowers in her hair and wields a silver fan in her hand. Scholars have observed that the sheet music she fingers in her other hand relates to a popular drinking song. A slight smile, we might even call it a smirk, enlivens her heart-shaped face. Part goddess of war, part party animal, it's hard to escape the notion that Marguerite de Sèvres was a full partner in Lageliere's creation of a likeness, at once full of vitality and suggestive of the sitter's potential for mischief. The whole lavish costume may have been constructed on the spot from props in the artist's studio. We know that Lagelière was the owner of this carved and painted harpsichord. Interestingly, the music on the keyboard instrument has 6 rather than 5 stave lines, indicating its music was intended to be played on a stringed instrument like a lute and not on a keyboard instrument. Underneath, clearly legible, are the words of a drinking song. Drink a lot, my dear friends, drink to the health. Such songs were fashionable for sophisticated women to sing at an evening gathering at home. We're now ready to take a look at the last works in our tour, and these are by the American artist John Singleton Copley. The year is 1771, and the location is New York City. The sitter is Margaret Kemble Gage, wife of General Thomas Gage, commander-in-chief of the British forces in North America. And the painter is John Singleton Copley of Boston, colonial America's most influential painter, who had come to New York City to paint the A-listers of the time. The son of Irish immigrants living in Boston and largely self-taught, Copley was determined and ambitious. By the time he was 20, he'd become colonial Boston's leading portrait painter. His tremendous success was rooted in his ability to appeal to his sitters' desire to be portrayed on a par with their English counterparts. And what was quite the rage was Turkery, dressing in the Turkish style, and he had the props to provide in his studio. Mrs. Gage, portrayed as a relaxed, serene, and confident woman, is seated languidly on a dark blue velvet sofa, her curved right arm and hand supporting her head. She's depicted wearing an uncorseted, iridescent rose silk caftan, loosely closed over a cream lace-trimmed chemise. Bedecked in pearls with a deep red jewel at her bosom, she wears a Turkish-styled headdress. The painter's uncanny ability to describe the crisp folds in Mrs. Gage's satin, coral-colored robe, as well as the intricacy of her fashionable hairstyle, certainly confirm his role as Boston's leading portraitist of the late colonial period. Copley enjoyed his reputation as a flashy painter, and this one has its fair share of dazzle. Note also his exquisite use of color, despite the fact that Copley had never seen the original works of the masters in Europe at the time this was painted. Mrs. Gage's portrait contains no narrative. Copley provided her with no manifest reason for her informal attitude. On the contrary, rather than diffusing the implications of her reverie with props, he enhances the portrait's erratic charge by dressing Mrs. Gage in the Turkish style, as I mentioned. Although her costume is not fastidiously Middle Eastern, even this oblique interpretation would have been immediately recognizable by the sitter and her contemporaries for its connotation of pleasure, liberality, and exoticism. In her turban and corseted caftan, a garment that completely covers her anatomy but titillates by virtues of loose layers that suggest stratas of underclothes, Mrs. Gage participates in what must be one of the most sexually charged portraits produced in colonial America. Now, Copley began working with what might be called Turkish adornments during the late 1760s, when he dressed several of his female sitters in woven belts and ermine-trimmed mantles. Mary Sherburne Bowers is Mrs. Gage's most direct prototype, with her Turkish-style ensemble and camelback sofa. But here Copley is not yet thought to complement the costume with an interpretive posture. Mary Sherburne was the daughter of Joseph Sherburne and Mary Watson. As her father's sole heir, she received a substantial fortune and married Jerathmael Bowers, a wealthy and prominent Quaker living in Swansea, Massachusetts. They had one son and three daughters. Now, this portrait is based on a British mezzotint by James McArdle, after a portrait of Lady Caroline Russell, which was painted by Sir Joshua Reynolds in 1659. Copley followed this model with precision, substituting the face of the sitter for that of Lady Russell. Tradition has it that the portrait was painted about the time of the sitter's marriage in 1763. Now, for Mrs. Bowers, as for Mary Harris Hooper, whom he seems to have painted just before his departure for New York, Copley acknowledged the contemporary fashionability of Turkery in England and obtained the vogue for his American sitters. Mary Harris Hooper was married to the younger Mr. Robert Hooper of Marblehead, Massachusetts. He was an eminent merchant who, on account of the magnitude of his business and his liberal character, was known all over New England by the sobriquet King Hooper. Importantly, note that Mrs. Hooper is wearing the same dress as Mrs. Gage, which suggests that Copley supplied the costume to both women. Copley was particularly pleased with this portrait, writing, "It is, I think, beyond compare the best lady's portrait I ever drew." In 1774, Copley finally fulfilled his wish to study the great works of art and left Boston to take his longed-for European grand tour. He never returned home. As for Mrs. Gage, we have an unsolved mystery. Was she a colonial informant? Someone told the Americans to expect the British in Lexington and Concord. General Gage had only told one other person beside his right-hand man. Might it have been his wife? While there's no proof of her complicity, it's revealing that Mrs. Gage and her 10 children were sent to England shortly after this in April of 1775. General Gage was recalled later that year. Presumably, their marriage stayed intact as they had another child in England. Our tour has now come to a close. I hope you've enjoyed learning about artists and their related artworks, and I'm certainly glad to answer any questions or hear your comments. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eleanor. What an interesting presentation. It's so fun to kind of see the different influences and different, kind of partner painting. So thank you so much. What a great tour. A virtual round of applause. We did have actually a question from Becky wondering, I'll actually go back to the painting if I can. The Vermeer, do you happen to know what she has in her hair? It is like an interesting hairstyle that she has. Do you happen to?
They're just ribbons. It's like
Ribbons.
Pieces of her hair are tied in satin ribbons.
Oh, do you think that was like the hairstyle of the time, or was she like,
Yes.
yeah?
Oh, no, I suspect it was the hairstyle of the time. And remember, it might have been somebody in Vermeer's family. So Vermeer typically showed the dress of his time. So I don't imagine he was showing anything that wouldn't have been of the time.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you. And then someone else in the chat was asking what was the name of the French artist, and the artist's name there is Largelier. right there if you wanted to see.
In the wood, I'm not seeing your image in
Oh,
which,
the French
in which,
artist. Yeah. Nicolas Largelier.
the Largelier.
Uh-huh, is his name. Thank you so much for the questions. If there is another question, I'd be happy to take maybe one or two more. But while you may be typing, I'll just remind you that this lecture, as well as previous ones done by the Timken, have been uploaded or will be uploaded to our social media channels, our Facebook and our YouTube channel. So please feel free to check those out if you would like to go back and watch any that we've put on previously. And also, if you needed information for future tours being put on by the Timken, future virtual tours, please check out our website and you can find the list of tours happening there and the information for all of those. We do have one more question. Do you think Mrs. Joseph Hooper maybe wanted to copy Mrs. Thomas Gage instead of borrowing the dress from the artist? So maybe that she wanted to copy that portrait rather
Well,
than.
actually, the portrait of Mrs. Hooper was done before Mrs. Gage.
Mhm.
So that's, I mean, no, we really don't know for certain. And I've read quite a bit of research on this. We really don't know if the dress was provided by Copley or not. The fact that he did this portrait of Mrs. Hooper shortly before he did Margaret Kemble Gage would make us think he provided the gown. It would seem to be just too much of a coincidence that they both chose the same,
Right.
gown to use. Having said that, Copley would often offer a choice of clothing to wear. So whether he strongly suggested that each of them wear this gown, whether just by coincidence each of them chose this gown, we just don't know.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you again for all of the questions. But yeah, again, thank you so much for joining us this morning. And thank you again, Eleanor, for such an interesting presentation.
Thank you all.
Fantastic.
Thank you all.
Of course. Everyone, have a great day. Thank you again for joining us.
Bye-bye.